Let me welcome you all to this event. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia here at Watson Institute and a professor in the Political Science Department. This is part of our series, Book Adda, and the term ought to be explained to those who are not from South Asia or are not familiar with South Asian terminologies. It has several meanings, the term Adda, but one important meaning is a deliberative space, a space for discussion. And that is the sense in which we have used this term for this series. We started this series 3 years ago, and in this series, we present books we have written ourselves at the center, or those who are intellectually involved with us have written, or those books that we must read and discuss anyway, for they are significant. This book, the book that we're discussing today, The Other 1%, belongs to the second and third categories. Devesh Kapur, one of the co-authors, has been significantly involved with us over the years. And this is also a significant book because it's the first, among other things, it's the first social science treatment of Indians in America, a relatively new immigrant group in this country. The book is co-authored by Sanjay Chakravarti and Nirvikar Singh, along with Devesh, and it also happens to be the first book in my new series, Modern South Asia, at the Oxford University Press in New York. I will first introduce Devesh Kapur, the one of the three authors present here, and then the format will be as follows. Devish will speak for 20 to 25 minutes. Then we have three discussants, each speaking for 15 minutes or so. I'll introduce them as they come up to present their thoughts. So let me start with now with introducing Devesh, who is the Madan Lal Sopti Professor for the Study of Contemporary India and Director, Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania and a Professor of Political Science there. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, a member of the Brookings Institution National Council of Applied Economic Research Panel for India, and the G20 Advisory Committee for the Finance Ministry of the Government of India. He's clearly engaged and has been for quite some time in policy-oriented work and in policy advisory roles. Of the several books that he has written, 3 are worthy of our attention for this event. He has produced 3 books on international migration, examining the effects at a global level. And that book is called Give Us Your Best and Brightest, The Global Hunt for Talent and Its Impact on the Developing World. Also, another book, a second book on the country of emigration. That book is called Diaspora, Democracy and Development, The Impact of International Migration from India, published by Princeton some years ago. And a third book, the book to be discussed today, on the country of immigration, The Other 1%, Indians in America, published earlier this year by my series at Oxford. He also has 2 new co-edited books, which should give you a range of his intellectual breadth. Rethinking Public Institutions in India and Navigating the Labyrinth Perspectives on India's Higher Education, both published earlier this year. In addition, he's also been involved in the so-called public sphere, publishing widely in newspapers and magazines, Foreign Policy, Business Standard, Financial Times, The Hindu, India Abroad, Indian Express, Newsweek, The Times of India, Wall Street Journal, and Project Syndicate. And prior to joining the University of Pennsylvania, he held appointments at the Brookings Institution in Washington, Harvard University, where we met, and both of us were junior professors there for some time and intersected, and the University of Texas at Austin. His educational background also indicates the breadth of his intellectual experience. He has a bachelor's in technology in chemical engineering from IIT in Banaras, BHU, a master's in chemical engineering from the University of Minnesota, and then a PhD in public policy from the Woodrow Wilson School at the Princeton University. Please welcome Devesh Kapur.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. So this book, as sort of Ashu said, is co-authored with Sanjoy and Nirvikar. So what I'm going to do is start with this motivation of why we wrote this book. So the first is, how did a population from a low-income developing country with weak human capital become the most sort of educated and highest income group in the world's most sort of advanced country in roughly a single generation. So this is all immigrants sort of in the United States. By immigrants, which means the countries here are by place of birth. The x-axis is the share with graduate professional degree. The y-axis is family income. And in a sense, the US immigration experience over the last half century is really encompassed by two groups at the two ends of the spectrum. That's Mexico and India. The size of the circles is really the size of the populations sort of in the United States, right? The group that comes closest actually in terms of education is from Taiwan, but not in terms of income. And this is part of a puzzle. How did this group end up at this as this sort of outlier group, within a single generation? The second is the size. So when the 1965 Immigration Reform Act was passed, Secretary of State, Rusk was testifying in Congress, and a congressman asked, but look, if we open up the doors, there are 300 million people in India. Suppose they all come, and he said, no. At most it'll be about 8,000 people in the next 5 years. In 2014, India was actually the largest source of new immigrants to the US, and the second largest source of total immigrants, sort of just after Mexico, right? So the two things that we're trying to understand is both in terms of this rapid increase in size of the population, and the second is its emergence as a group with the highest income and education, at least measured by the US Census. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is to take you through some background context of immigration to the US, some characteristics of this group, then the third, which is the quintessential sort of American story of assimilation. Then I'll spend some time on trying to explain these outcomes. And when I first began to give this talk, which was before the elections, I did not have the question mark. Now I do have a question mark because I really don't know the future. So just the context. So this is sort of the last 200 years of immigration, to the US. You see these. You have immigration that increases. You have a degree of political backlash, goes down, It again goes up, again you have this backlash, and then as many of you know, you have this huge backlash in exactly about 100 years back when sort of immigration really begins to cease, and then gradually picks up after World War II and really picks up after 1965 when the Immigration Reform Act sort of is passed. At the same time, what you see is that where people come from has changed, of course, very, very rapidly in these 200 years. The first one was the mid-19th century great northern European wave, where about 14 million people came. Then it shifts the late 19th, early 20th century, when you have very large numbers coming from East Europe and from the south of like Europe. And then, of course, after 1965, which is the great sort of migration, the sort of Hispanic migration, especially from Mexico, but also a very sizable increase in migration from Asia. Now, the few Indians who had trickled in at the early part of the 20th century, that really ends with this passage of this act called the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. And what it does is it basically bars any immigration from the zone that is shaded green. And after that, until 1965, it's a very, very small number. So in fact, if you look at how the US Census classified this group, it's interesting how the racial classification changes. They were classified as white, then Hindu, then other race, then again white, then Asian Indian. And it's a extremely complex story of why it was classified in which way, et cetera, which we can discuss sort of in the Q&A. But what is interesting is that the first half of the century, Indians fought very hard to be classified as white. And then after 1970s, they classified very hard not to be classified as white. And why that's the case, it's an interesting story, but that's effectively how they're now classified. So what you see is that by 1930, the number of Indians is very, very tiny. In fact, in the 1940, 1950 census, they aren't even measured separately because their numbers have dwindled and are so small. And you really see these numbers beginning to pick up after the mid-1960s. And this, of course, begins to happen after the great change with the 1965 Act. So since then, these are the four countries of origin of legal permanent residence sort of in the United States. There's Mexico, Philippines, India, and China. And you see the main sources are really the Hispanic migrations and migrations like from Asia. But what is sort of interesting is that almost 60% of all Indians in the United States have come after 2000. It's a very young immigrant population. The bulk of it has really come in the last 15 odd years. In fact, more Indian immigrants have obtained permanent legal residence in the last 15 years than over the entire 20th century. Right? That is the magnitude of this change and the recent vintage of this group. And so in our book, what we sort of break up the immigration pattern in three phases. One is what we call the early movers, which is about 12,000 a year, which is till the late 1970s. And this, in a sense, is the best and brightest. This is the doctors and the IIT engineers, etc. Then from then till about the early 90s, mid-90s, is largely, though not entirely, a story of family reunification. So those who already came, they sponsor their parents, their sisters, their brothers, et cetera, et cetera. And so the quality of human capital actually of that group actually drops. Then after the mid-90s, you see a huge change again, and that's the big IT generation, and where they are all at least have a minimum of a graduate degree. Now, what I think is worthy to note here is that what you see in phase 3 is that employment-based visas begin to dominate. And this, I'll argue at the end of my talk, is a key reason why their incomes are the highest. It is not just who comes to the US that matters for labor market outcomes, but how you come to the US that makes a big, big difference. And what really stands out, where Indians are a complete outlier compared to any other immigrant group, is that they have predominantly, or relative to any other group, a much larger share has come through employment-based visas rather than other visas, especially family reunification. Now, just some, to those of you who know sort of India a little bit, just some characteristics of this group. So one is the majority are born sort of in India. That's about 60%. About 28% were born in the US, and 13% in other countries. What was interesting was when we were looking at the US census, we were surprised how many people born in Pakistan in the US census checked themselves off as Indian. And we weren't sure quite why that's the case. But we first thought that these were people who had migrated around partition. But then we truncated the data to those born after 1955 in Pakistan. And it still was quite a significant number. And then we found all these articles sort of in the Dawn, which is the one of Pakistan's major newspapers, and other Pakistani media by Pakistani Americans, that after 9/11, it made it easier for them in the US to, in public conversation, when asked by strangers, they would just say they're Indian because it would not lead to any sort of hassles. And that seems to be showing up in the census as well. Now, they are outliers among immigrants in 3 ways. One, as I said, education and income. They have the highest levels of educational attainment and income in the US. The second is a concentration in one occupation, which is IT computers. It's a real outlier there. And the third, as I said, is a very distinctive immigration status, which is employment-based rather than family-based. The Indian-born and the US-born Indians are 2 very distinctive groups. Most of those born in the US are still very young. 5 out of 6 are below the age of 25. So actually the book does not look that much on the second generation because the vast majority of them are still not in the labor force. And so the sample sizes in the US census are really often very small to do much robust analysis. What's interesting is the right-hand side. So if you see, about 68% of the Indian-born living in the US have a college degree and above, compared to about 7.8% of the US population as a whole, and about 20% for, 7.8% of the Indian population living within India, and about 20% of the US population as a whole. We actually argue in this book that Indian immigration to the US is by far the most selective migration since World War II of any 2 pairs of countries that we are sort of aware of. There is no other migration that is as selective. The only migration we could find that came relatively somewhat close was of Russian Jews to Israel around the early 90s when the Soviet Union fell. But they were moving from a country which had high levels of education compared to, in the Indian case, where the levels of education were much, much lower. This group is increasingly, India is very heterogeneous heterogeneous. So you would expect the immigrants also to be fairly heterogeneous, and it's becoming increasingly so. So it sort of initially until the 80s, they were dominated by, people who were from Gujarat or Punjab. That has become much less now. In fact, the largest single language group after Hindi is Telugu. The US consulate in Hyderabad issues more visas than any other consulate in Asia other than Shanghai. And that's the emergence of this particular group. So what you see here is their incomes across the different states. And what you see is that in each state, their incomes are higher than the average income of people living in that state. Here you see how this income varies by their ethnicity. You see that the Punjabi speakers have the least sort of education and the least sort of income. Gujarati speakers, their education is not that high, but their incomes are pretty high, comparable to the highest income, which tells you how much education might matter for income. And that's of course because this group is much more concentrated as entrepreneurs, and that might explain it. We believe, but we can't really show this because of these, you can't get this data from the census, but there is some data from Pew. One reason why I think the concentration of illegal immigrants among Indians in the US, Punjabi speakers have a very high concentration of that. And that also has effects on labor market outcomes. Now, the one thing, when we did a spatial analysis of where they live, what's interesting is that 4/5 of the Indian population lives in counties that have median household incomes at least one standard deviation above the mean. Now, why that matters in a US that is much more unequal now than it used to be is that this gives structural advantages to the second generation because they live in areas with access to better schools, etc., because of where they live. This is just an example of some work in the book. The richest and the poorest Indians in the US live within several miles of each other. Manhattan and Queens, the same with Yuba Valley in California and Silicon Valley. These are barely 30, 40 miles from each other. So the story of assimilation. The first thing we always think about assimilation is sort of naturalization rates. This is just comparing data of assimilation rates of Indian and Chinese immigrants. And what you can see is that the assimilation rate of immigrants from India has begun to lag. But that's what we show is that's not because they don't want to, but they can't because so many of them are on H-1B visas, and the queue is so long that they can't apply for conversion to permanent residency and the path to immigration. One other way of thinking about assimilation is residential clustering. This is all the major Asian groups, and this is by census tract, which is the PUMA. And what you see is that partly because they are more wealthy, they can afford to spread out much more. Because you can afford to move to the suburbs if you have more income, and that's effectively, I think, what you're seeing here. But what is interesting is how the type of visa affects also your residential clustering. So if you look at two fields, one is computers and software and computers, and compare it with medical, which is the doctors. The doctors who come to the US who have their primary medical education outside, they can only stay here, and they come here sort of on a J1 visa. The engineers come on a H1B visa. But the J1 visa requires you to go back unless you agree to serve in an underserved area. So if you go to small town America, the majority of physicians are essentially foreign physicians, because they can only stay in the US if they agree to serve in, Johnson City, Tennessee, like for instance. So there's a great book by Abraham Verghese, which was nominated for the Pulitzer, where he looks at AIDS coming to small town America, looking at Johnson City in Tennessee. And virtually all the doctors there are Indian doctors. And so it's a very interesting story of how they confront AIDS, and because they themselves are very socially conservative. One thing which you see is of course, we know that as immigrants come, the parents retain the language that they come, but by the second generation, the children lose their felicity with the native tongue and speak much more at English, and that seems to be happening across the board. We looked quite hard at gender inequality. We looked at son preference. We looked at changes between the first and second generations. So this census has different occupation groups, and managerial and professional occupations is the group with the highest incomes, as you would expect. So this is men first generation and women first generation by race. This is all census data. So what you see is, if you compare first generation Indian men and first generation Indian women, the men are more represented in professional occupations. But if you move to the second generation, it sort of reverses. In either case, both have the highest fraction in these occupations. But you see this reversal that takes place from the second generation. Now, women are actually more represented in these occupations. Now, it's not clear to us whether that is because of bias or, the gender discrimination that Indians bring with them when they come. It could also be because many, under US law, H-1B visas spouses were not allowed to work. And often the spouses are like women, so their underrepresentation might have to do not with their willingness to work, but their legal inability to work. But unfortunately, you cannot separate that analytically from the data. This is the way in which immigrants come. They set up their own organizations. This is a spatial mapping of all these organizations across the US. What are these organizations? This is by type. About half of them are religious organizations, and the other half are on sort of different aspects. There are regional organizations on their ethnic identities, and there's a range of religious organizations. I'll switch to their political behavior. So one is, they are among the most Democrat-leaning of any large immigrant group. And I'll show you some data. Only about a third votes, in part because about half is naturalized, so the other half can't vote. Of the half that is naturalized, about 2/3 vote, which is about the average for Asian American groups. These limited numbers, they are demographically concentrated in states that are strongly Democrat-leaning. And so you find that this group, what it does is, it tries to be more influential politically through other ways other than just their franchise. But even then, the franchise does matter. So this is when the Indian Prime Minister Modi first came to the US, he went to Madison Square Garden, and a number of congressmen showed up. So we looked at where these congressmen were from. And what this does is, if you see the likelihood of a congressman showing up, if his or her district has more than 0.5% Indians versus less than that, it increases fourfold. So even at these small numbers, it's very clear that they're more likely to respond to their constituents when there is a certain sizable number. We looked at this, which is this like database from the FEC. So it's about, I forget, about 12 million records. We have an algorithm with which we could pull out those of Indian sort of origin. And the behavior is actually seems to be pretty much close to the mean in terms of financial contributions. This is for 3 election cycles. Now, of course, I have to be cautious here because the FEC data excludes contributions to PACs and super PACs. It doesn't include that. So it could be a lot more different, and that we can't speak to. Now, this is about which party, their partisan sort of affiliations. So this is a survey I did of Indian Americans 2004. And what's interesting is that even when they have just come to the US, they are much more the Democrat than Republican. So if you see less than 5 years, 41% says they are Democrat, about 8% Republican. The longer they stay in the US, they become more Democrat and less Republican. So what you see is more than 21 years, far more of the undecideds move to the Democrat camp than the Republican. Now, we looked at it in 2008. Did you vote for Obama, McCain, or someone else? Overwhelmingly, it was Obama, among the highest of any group in the United States. What is interesting is it also goes against conventional political science or observations that as incomes increase, you tend to vote Republican until at least the last election. And here you see actually that is income has no effect on their political behavior. In this election cycle, so you see this thing between, this was a survey done from UC Riverside on political views of main Asian American groups. This was April, and as you can see, much larger, again, support for the Democrat than the Republican Party. They had both a much more favorable and a much more unfavorable impression of Trump compared to the Chinese respondents. I asked some of my Chinese friends why they thought that might be the case, and they claimed it's just that Indians are much more have much more vocal views. Now, when they did it in October of 2016, you again see, compared to all other Asian American groups or the major Asian American groups, they are again the most Democrat-leaning group. So what you see is consistently over every single survey that we have evidence, they favor the Democrats over Republicans by a factor of 5 or 6 to 1, every single survey. Now, this is actually not obvious why. This is a group that is socially conservative. Large numbers are entrepreneurs. They are high income. All of those things that would tend to make them lean more Republican. And in fact, in 2004, there were a series of articles from people in the Republican establishment saying this is the natural Republican constituency. And yet we see they have actually moved even further. And one reason we found, but this is not from survey data, is actually religion. A number of PhD dissertations, etc., what they show is when they do these things, they find that the turn of the Republican Party towards evangelical Christianity, because most of them are not from that religion, has turned them away from the Republicans. Okay, so very quickly explaining some outcomes. So what we argue is it's really a triple selection. very large numbers of these groups come from the upper caste, like from India. So there is a social selection taking place within India. There's an exam-based selection in India, that how you get access to higher education. And the third is entry selection. If you're coming from a country as far as India, the US immigration system really favors those with STEM backgrounds, and they happen to have this. So to put it in a simple way, it's not that somehow there's something about being Indian, because otherwise India would have done much better and people would not have to leave India in the first place. So that, that is very clearly not the answer. It's just that those who come from the tail end of a distribution, and you're comparing the tail of one distribution with the mean of another distribution, right? And so that's not very surprising that their outcomes are, better. But that's not the whole story. The second is this occupational concentration. You see, if you came as an engineer and joined a manufacturing sector, so India's very failures in manufacturing meant that far more Chinese engineers who came went to the manufacturing sector, because that was their experience. Whereas India, because India failed in manufacturing, they came into a sector that happened to boom. So whereas earlier you would have to climb up the stairs, they happened to step into an elevator, and the elevator just took them up. And that was pure happenstance. Then concentration in certain occupations. The other is, physicians. Even as early as the late 60s, early 70s, 1 out of 7 of every new physicians in the US was from India. This is from a country whose own health indicators are, shall we say, rather modest. It's true, and you can see we even got all the exam-like results of all the foreign medical graduates who take these exams. These are exam results of all foreign graduates of all other medical schools. So you see, you're getting a selection from India, because obviously Indian doctors are not that good if you look at Indian health outcomes. It's just that those who are coming here are coming from the top tail of that distribution. The other is, PhDs. If you look at fields like computers or engineering, about 1 out of 11, 1 out of 12 of all PhDs is from India in these fields. So to give you an example, India, produces about 20,000 PhDs every year, of which about, if you're lucky, 10% is of the quality that is here. So effectively, India has gifted to the US half a century of human capital stock, and its effects on Indian higher education have been, shall we say, less than good. Then it's the other, selection story is the how, right? So look at the comparison between Chinese and Indian immigrants on their visa type, right? So what you see is that for Chinese immigrants, the refugee and asylee visa is very important, right? It's really tiny. And for Indians, the work visa, the employment-based, is much more important. Labor market outcomes, when you control for everything else, are much better for employment-based rather than if you come in as an asylee or a refugee. English, it so happened that both the US and India were colonized by the same power, so that helped. Then the fact that they are socially conservative, right? So this is sort of Indian families compared to all other social groups. So families as share of households, married couples as share of families, and family poverty rates, they are correlated. I want to be very careful not saying these are causal, but there is a strong correlation. So if you look at, for instance, things like their marital status, or if you look at children's living arrangements with two married parents, you again see Indians are an outlier. Again, in part, reflecting their social conservativeness. Now, this actually matters for income outcomes, right? So if you look at just this particular group, right, which is, this is comparing US-born Indian compared to non-Hispanic white, which is a census, classification. And just look at high school or less, right? So there is for most immigrants whose education is low, there is a penalty in the US labor market because if your education is low, because you don't have access to union jobs, which are usually held by those who are born here. But, so this is individual income. When you switch to family income, you see it changes. Because far more of Indians who are high school or less live as families, so family income is larger. Whereas in the other case, they usually stay alone or with one other person. Very quickly, some problems with our analysis or some weaknesses. We don't have any data on reverse migration. So we don't have the other selection effect on who goes back, right? It's very possible that they do better in the data compared to immigrants from, say, Taiwan or China, because the best and brightest of Chinese, Korean immigrants are going back, right? I mean, we can't rule that out, at least. And we know that reverse brain drain accelerates as country of origin grows rapidly. In fact, Koreans today are less in number immigrants than they were in 2000. So that's one sort of weakness that we cannot sort of address. There's a range of other things, the technology and policy changes, the global migration from India. But what I'm going to do is to just focus on this particular part, which is the supply side of the story, right? Which is the huge growth of engineering education in India that made this possible. Some unintended consequences. So one is actually the US-India relationship, actually the economic relationship is less based on trade, but on this labor migration, right? Some estimates from Peterson Institute that just this labor migration is worth in the relationship about 50 billion and exceeds both US good or service imports from India. They contribute about 3 billion annually to US Social Security funds, which actually a large part of it doesn't vest, which means that most of them have to go back before they work for the 40 quarters in which you get your Social Security. So the estimates are that Indian workers in the US have had a net transfer to the US taxpayer of about $15 billion, $10 to $15 billion in the last 2 decades. It's essentially you come and work and you have to go back, but you've paid your Social Security taxes, which you will not get. Now, I think what I just want to, this last part on sort of on the future. So this was done by Pew in 2015, before all these debates sort of began, where they sort of projected how over 100 years, how US immigration and the composition of immigrants was going to change. And as you can see, the big change that begins to occur in the next few decades by their projections then was that migration from Asia begins to exceed migration, the Hispanic migration, right? But what has happened is, as we know in the elections and since the elections, the key visa form through which Indians came to the US, the H-1B visa, has come under severe attack. So this is from The Economist of last week, which is what actually just yesterday the US Department of Labor named these 3 Indian IT firms that they are bringing in Indian workers and paying them less, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not getting the best and brightest, we're just getting people who are reasonably good. But I think if you put it in a larger context, right? So this is the top countries of origin of highly educated migrants living in OECD countries and the changes, right? So immigrants from India are now across OECD countries the most educated group of any immigrant group. They are the largest immigrant group in the UK and Canada, second largest in US, third and fourth largest. They will be the third also in Australia. and now also in Ireland. They will be in the top 5. It's an unusual immigration pattern. It's highly concentrated in Anglo-Saxon countries. In fact, the US-India relationship has this mirror sort of effect. The US is the largest immigrant country now in the world. India is the largest emigrant country. And in an atmosphere where international migration is coming under threat, right? Just the past few weeks, or what you see is the big places of migrants for India, UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Gulf, you see very large declines or threats of, right? Australia and New Zealand have just done what the US has done in the past few weeks. The Gulf has been doing it in the past 12 months. And you see the very sharp decline in number of Indian students going to the UK just in the last 5 years. So this morning, the New York Times sort of had this story, which sort of basically alludes to the fact that all these uncertainties, the changes in policies, all of that, and this is the morning sort of headline from the Times, and this, I think, captures a very different story from where I started off. And that's where I am.
Thank you, Devish. Our first commentator is Prema Ann Kurian, professor of sociology at Syracuse. She is a Brown graduate. She got her PhD in sociology in 1993, and the most relevant part of her CV for this discussion is that her last 2 books are on Indian migrants in the US. And the book in 2007 was entitled A Place at the Table, Multiculturalism and the Development of American Hinduism. And there's a forthcoming book in a couple of months, in June, entitled Ethnic Church Meets Mega Church, Indian American Christianity in Motion. Please welcome Prema Kurian.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, kind of on the other side. As Ashu mentioned, I was a graduate student here, and it's so nice to come back and meet some of my old professors, some of them are here. Professor Lina Fruzzetti, Professor Paget Henry, thank you both for coming. So I will address this book from my perspective as a sociologist, and also from the perspective of some of the research that I've done on Indian Americans. So I really enjoyed reading the book. I think it gave a wonderful overview, a big picture background of Indian American migration, geographical settlement patterns by occupation, income, education, linguistic background, and a lot of other information. And there are lots of nice readable charts, and you saw many of them there, and I love the fact that they're readable. Many times charts are not very readable, so that was lovely. And for me personally, it's really great to have some of this background data at my fingertips so that I don't need to go and invest the time to find it for my own work. So I'm currently working on a book on Indian American political mobilization at the national level. And so some of this background data is really helpful for me. I'm also doing some research on Indian Americans in 4 cities in Canada and the US, but they include New York, New Jersey, and Northern California. And there are lots of facts and figures about the composition of the settlement in the 2 areas that are just wonderful. Again, it just saves me so much of time and energy. So the book indicates that it's based on social science disciplines and methods. But the 3 authors, one is a political scientist, one is a geographer, and the other one is an economist. So there is really no sociologist as an author, and that is a perspective that I kind of thought was missing. Now, sociology is a broad field, so I can't say that there isn't some overlap, but I do think that there are certain distinct sociological perspectives that were missing from the book. And this is the perspective from which I approach the book, and I will talk today. And I also want to talk today as an Indian American myself. So the book claims we look at Indian Americans from an Indian perspective rather than an American one, and we focus on the diversity among Indian Americans. So I question what an Indian perspective is and whether one can really ignore an American perspective and how it impacts the lives of Indian Americans. And then another issue I had is that the preface indicates that this is a book focused on the whole Indian American community, including its marginal, less visible members. But I'm actually not sure if this is the case. The discussion of the non-elite members, and you saw that even in the presentation today, was very, very brief. So the question that the book starts out with is a good one, and Devesh talked about it, so I won't go over it, but the basic question of how is it that a population from really low, one of the poorest countries around the world, has come here and become one of the most successful. And the answer given, I think, is really good, if not particularly new or innovative. So Asian American Studies has been making this argument for a long time about Asian immigrants more generally. The argument here is that there was a triple selection. This is a group that is selected in India due to the nature of unequal structures in India. So structures of caste and class that provided access to higher education to only a certain group, who was selected for entry due to US selection policies that are oriented towards high-skilled immigrants and students. So, one of the strengths of the book is that it goes beyond, saying that by talking about some of the details about why India was able to take advantage of the IT boom in the US. So, there's this discussion of the British colonialism and Indian English education, adopting the Soviet model of investing in engineering colleges with financial support from the Soviet Union in the immediate post-independence period, which was crucial in getting the IITs developed. The development of technology services and consulting companies in India, TCS, Infosys, who've been very, very crucial in the big H-1B migration. Also the discussion about the gender and marriage norms, that privilege early marriage, almost universal marriage, male-led migration, patriarchal structures where women are expected to move along with the spouse, which means that there are very few female-headed households. Okay, so this was all very interesting and very good to have it out there. And so they keep saying several times in the book that there is no other secret sauce to explain the success of Indian Americans. It is just due to this selection, this triple selection. Apparently this is in response to Amy Chua's work, but you should know that at least in sociology we don't take her book very seriously. So the first half of the book that details the early history, migration, and settlement patterns, I thought were the strongest parts of the book. Very clearly and effectively presented and argued. I love the historical chapter, and I love the parallels that you draw between developments 100 years ago and the developments more recently. But even here, I thought, even in that first half, I thought you left out some important factors. For instance, how religion shaped the migration patterns. Why is it that the early migration was largely Punjabi Sikh immigrants? Religion played a role. And the role that the Sikhs played within British colonialism was due to their religion and their designation as a martial race. Why are Malayali nurses, which again you talk about, why are they largely Christian? Again, religion played a role in why Malayali nurses were largely Christian. And so also a discussion of how selection shapes a pattern of migration of religious groups from India to the US. So the Pew data shows that the distribution of religious groups among Indian Americans in India, in the US, is skewed. Hindus are underrepresented. In the US, they're only 51%, whereas in India, they're supposed to be 80%. Christians are overrepresented, about 18% in the US, less than 2% in India. Sikhs are estimated at 5%, but Sikhs strongly feel that this is a big underestimate, and the Pew never actually did a study. It's just guesses. And they 18% Pew data. And it's likely that Sikhs are more because in Canada and the UK, there are very, very high proportions of the Indian population in these two countries. Another thing that the book talks about is the fact that distances prevented people with low human capital from entering illegally in large numbers. But And there's only a very brief mention of the undocumented group among Indian Americans, but no further discussion. But India actually ranks 4th now in terms of having the largest number of undocumented immigrants in the US. It is the country in Asia with the largest number of undocumented immigrants in the US. So why the increase? I mean, I would have liked to know. I mean, they talk about pathways being, it seems like people are coming and overstaying on business and tourist visas, and this is not from the book. This is from other data. But, that, I think, is an important aspect which is not discussed in the book. So I see from the endorsements at the back of the book that the comprehensive approach of the book is lauded. But actually in sociology, this is not seen as a strength. This is seen as a bit of a weakness. So, when students come to me, about doing research projects on some new immigrant groups, I tell them, doing a study which is like all you ever wanted to know about X group is not a good sociological project. You need to have a focus and you need to have an argument, because otherwise you'll be spread too thin. So, you need to be able to contribute to the literature beyond just a broad descriptive study. Now, as I said, the first part of the book certainly makes a nice, tight argument about the migration patterns and the selection patterns. Where I thought it gets a little more scattered and diffuse was in the second half, which is focused on assimilation, where there was a lot of data that's put in there, but not a clear argument. I mean, I couldn't step back and say, okay, so what is the argument here about the assimilation patterns of Indian Americans? So, there was a discussion of a lot of topics, a lot based on secondary literature, anecdotes from the media, like this discussion of Abraham Varghese, being in a small town. Okay, so, just talking about well-known Indian Americans rather than a broader sense, from some kind of data. So, I mean, I thought that was one of the issues. The 2 entrepreneurship chapters, I thought, were, I mean, maybe it's just my own background. I mean, those were the ones that I had the hardest time just trying to get, what is the argument here? Whereas, I could really see the argument in Pawan Dhingra's book about the motel owners. I could see the argument in Annalee Saxenian's book of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and their entrepreneurial networks from home countries, host countries, and I could see the argument there. I was not very clear about what the argument was in this book with the 2 entrepreneurship chapters. And I noted that, the first chapter, which is based on an anonymous survey, had a 2% response rate. And so I'm wondering now, what does that say? A 2% response rate. I mean, how much can you, take away from a study with that kind of response rate? The second chapter, which is actually based on case studies and should have been the one that I would have loved, but the problem I had with that is that they were all kind of based on short biographical accounts. So again, in sociology, we are taught that theme-based discussions are better than biography-based discussions, because then you can see, I mean, what is it that you're supposed to take away from these cases? And so I saw all of these little snippets from, about the famous people, the famous entrepreneurs. But again, I wasn't sure what larger lesson I was supposed to draw from that. Okay, so now I want to just come back to this argument that this is from an Indian perspective rather than an American perspective. So, I mean, one of the implications is that focusing on the linguistic diversity within the Indian Americans is an Indian perspective. That is certainly true. Most outsiders cannot even distinguish all of the linguistic groups, and that certainly matters because it's not just a matter of language. I mean, each linguistic area in India is has its own culture, its own religious patterns, so very, very different. So that certainly is important. But is that the only meaning of an Indian perspective? For instance, the discussion of religion, it comes up only in a few places. One is when you're discussing Sikhs, that religion is named. So it seems to me that Hinduism kind of is the unnamed norm for the rest of the book. And this is why religion is never problematized anywhere else, except when you're discussing Sikhs. And then, of course, when you're talking about the election data, you do mention religion, but again, without going into more detail about how religion might shape why a lot of Indian Americans vote Democratic. There is no discussion of caste issues either. Now, the data shows that religious organizations become the primary means through which Indians form communities and transnational links. So, I mean, clearly then it impacts settlement, it impacts assimilation, but there was really no discussion of that. So, I mean, it seemed to me that religion was a black box in the book that was not unpacked. Whereas, in my own work, I have seen that religion, is very important. And I have to tell you, I did not start out with the intent of focusing on religion. Religion kind of popped up in my research, and that's when I decided that I needed to pay attention to religion. So it's not even that I had these, blinders and I was just going to look for religion. I mean, in the Indian context, anyone who's been in India knows that religion is important in so many ways. Caste is also very important in so many ways, unspoken most of the time, but it has real effects. Now, race is another black box that I thought. I thought that since, and the argument is that since it's from an Indian perspective, and so they're using categories from home that are more important in shaping outcomes than categories from the host country. But race and how Indian Americans are categorized in the US has clearly been particularly important in the last few months. For instance, the H-1B targeting. Now, 70% of H-1B visas have been going to Indians. And so, I mean, when the discussions of cutting the H-1B visas, either explicitly or implicitly, there may be kind of a racialized attitude there. Now, the article that you mentioned today in New York Times about the substantial decline. So it says that there's a decline of 26% in terms of undergraduate applications, 15% for graduate applications, 20% decline in H-1B. And here's a quote from that article. This is a young woman. She says, "We don't know what might happen to us while walking on the streets there," said Kanika Arora, a 20-year-old student in Mumbai who is reconsidering her plan to study in the US. "They might just think we are terrorists." Recent attacks on people of Indian descent in the US are explosive news in India. A country once viewed as a promised land now seems for many to be dangerously inhospitable. To me, that sounds very much like Indians thinking about their race and racial identity and how it might impact them if they came to the US. Very briefly, in my own work and in my work on Indian American political activism, two issues that came up as being very important are race and religion. Now, again, I want to say that I did not start out with these categories. In fact, I resisted religion. I was tired of studying religion, and I wanted to do something else, and I wanted to have some other framework. But it kind of popped up. And so I look at how religion, that is majority-minority status in the US and in India, shapes political mobilization around US issues and around homeland issues in strikingly different ways, even though these religious groups are very different in terms of the characteristics. So, Christians in the US are very different from, in terms of their political activism, from Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. When it comes to India, Hindus are very different than Christians, Sikhs, and Muslims in terms of their activism patterns. There are also differences between those who mobilize as Indians and those who mobilize as South Asians. And here, race plays an important role. It's not that these groups are racially different, but how they understand their race, whether it's similar to the European ethnic paradigm or whether it's more similar to a minority racial paradigm, is what distinguishes those who prefer to identify often as Indians versus South Asians. So, I mean, race, and then there's an intersection of race and religion. I mean, these things seem to be very important. So, very, very quickly, to wrap up, I was interested to see that, the funding for this research came from the Indian government. And I was just very interested in how that might have shaped what questions or what issues were focused on, and what might the authors have done if there hadn't been that funding. I mean, if you didn't have that funding and if you're going to do a study of Indian Americans, what issues might you have focused on? Would it have been different? Just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Our next commentator is Richard Wright. Orville Dreyfus, right? Chair. I'm quite used to Dreyf. Yes. So this is some connection with that, I guess. Chair of Public Affairs and Professor of Geography at Dartmouth College, has worked extensively in his career on spatial patterns of immigration, of racial segregation, racial settlements, etc., and of pertinence to our discussion today is his membership of the panel on U.S. immigration and integration for the National Academy of Sciences between 2013 and 2015. Richard.
So, thank you everyone for coming, staying, listening. Thanks to Brown University and the Watson Institute for inviting me and putting me up, and apparently going to eat and drink in a little bit. So, I'm going to be brief, but hopefully I'll be a little provocative. So, I like this book a lot. It was detailed, thoughtful, well written, organized. I thought it was methodologically quite careful. It was highly interdisciplinary. So I was curious what the sociologists would think, but I'm a geographer, and there is a geography chapter, so I was cool with that. One of the co-authors is a geographer, so, that's okay. But it was historically accurate. I thought the history chapter was terrific. I thought there were some interesting sociological perspectives, but I'm just a friend of sociology. I'm not a sociologist. I thought it was really interesting in terms of politics and public policy as well. So I like the book a lot. So what I'm going to do is talk about my relationship with the book very briefly, and then I'm going to delve into the future in a couple of ways. And that might sound like a foolish thing to do, but why not? So my connection with this book goes back 40 years, actually. I was a young man and starting my graduate education at Indiana University, where I got my master's and PhD. And I was traveling to Indiana from New Orleans, and I stopped in Macomb, Mississippi. And the hotel there was run by an Indian gentleman. And I can remember as this I think I was a first or second year graduate student, thinking, there's a research project there. What's that person doing in Macomb, Mississippi, of all places in the United States? If you were going to run a hotel and you were not white, that is not a location that I would have chosen to run a hotel. But there's a research project there, and obviously someone's done some research project. I never got to that one. I got distracted with some other stuff at Indiana. But that one has stuck with me, and here we are in the book, and I'm reading about Gujaratis all over the place, running motels, and I really quite liked how the book got away from the model minority and actually exposed us to now I'm a sort of economic geographer, so this maybe resonated with more than other commentators. But I really like the stuff on thinking about the diversity of pathways. The other thing about the book, it reminded me of an advertisement for an office supply company. And the advertisement goes something like this: you need this? Well, we got that. So I'd be reading the book, and I'm thinking, have they missed this? I turn the page, and there it is. And it's like, we got that. And so I thought they covered things quite well. And so I was quite impressed. The other thing I like about the book is its timing. I mean, it's exquisite, all right? 2014, Indians become the most prominent demographic group by nativity to arrive on our shores in that particular year. So, my goodness, I mean, you got to be good, you got to be lucky in this business when you do a book. But so I like the timing a lot. All right, so to the future. I'm a bit more optimistic. And I'm going to tell you why I'm a bit more optimistic. I don't know how many people have quoted Jim Morrison in this esteemed university, in this esteemed room, but the future's uncertain and the end is always near, is a line from a Doors song. The future absolutely is uncertain and the end actually might be very near. But in terms of the future immigration to the United States from India, it's not perhaps as bleak as Devesh perhaps portrayed. He mentioned Chinese immigrants likely to go back more often, and I've seen that in other kinds of sources. Indian immigrants already outnumber Chinese. Therefore, they have more potential to increase their numbers through non-quota family reunification and then through family-based connections. The average size of a Chinese family is 3 people. Average size of an Indian family is 5.3 people. So there is another reason why I think the demographic momentum that we've seen in the last, particularly the last 15 years, but going back to the late 60s, I think will continue. And the other instance that's worth mentioning, because it explains a little bit about why immigration from Mexico has declined, China's population is aging, India's population is relatively young. 47% of its population was less than 25 years old compared to 32% for China. And indeed, of course, most people in this room know that by sometime in the 2020s, India will take over China as the largest country in the world. So even if H-1Bs are curtailed in some ways, or there are restrictions put on L visas and H-1Bs, maybe that ratio of employment-based visas to family-based visas will now switch toward something that looks more like the average rather than some kind of unusual exception that is India. So there are 4 blurbs on the back cover. You got Larry Summers to write for you. That was quite the achievement. You also got Janet Meisner. That's great too. I want to quote Patrat Banu Mehta's book jacket blurb. The book will unsettle many entrenched assumptions and open a research agenda. So let me just talk about a research agenda and one entrenched assumption. The assumption is this model minority that I think we all should speak out about in our classrooms or wherever we stand. And the book does a great job of unsettling this stereotypical view of Asians and Asian Americans. So this idea of triple selection, I think, is a really useful way to think about why a group in the United States would succeed. I was particularly pleased to see that. I think the authors did a good job of showing the diversity of types of employment that Asians and Indians engage in the United States. And I like that. The American system of employment-based entry is also key to this argument, of course. And another way to think about that, and I'm currently teaching an immigration course at Dartmouth, is to think about how poor people get into this country. They can't unless they come in through, unless they enter without inspection or overstay a visa or enter through family options. There are very, very few ways poor people can enter this country and stay here with any degree of permanence and lack of precarity. So I think the book does a really nice job of sort of unpacking this trope of the triple package of superiority complex, insecurity, and impulse control that some writers use, Chua included, to explain Asian success. I like that. Okay, so some research that I think can come out of this. 3 pieces of research. 3, 1, 2. 2 big pieces of research. One is, so what I do, I teach and research in several areas. I'm interested in US immigration, I teach a course on that. I'm interested in racial mixing, I teach a course on that. So I'm interested in labor markets, marriage markets, and housing markets. And I'm not going to talk about marriage markets, although there's some interesting stuff to do there. So I'm going to talk about a labor market piece of research that could come out of this, and a housing market piece of research that could come out of this. So a labor market piece of research is along the following lines. One of the big anxieties in the United States is not only about non-whites entering the country in unprecedented numbers, but also about the number of STEM graduates and STEM employment and technology-oriented activities in the country. And it seems, though, if you, and so I'm actually engaged in a research project on STEM work. I've got a project, a paper just came out on if you have a STEM degree, do you get a STEM job? I'm almost finished writing a paper on STEM migration. And there is work to do on the connection between the foreign-born and the native-born in the STEM labor market. I know no research that singles out this kind of perspective by nativity. And I think there is a rich research agenda that will focus on either Chinese and Indian Americans and Chinese Americans in the STEM labor market. So if you go to regional science, or you go to regional studies, or you go to economic geography, it's STEM left, right, and center. And there's a lot to, and there's, if you go into economics, labor economics, there's a lot of concern and interest in STEM employment, but rarely do scholars separate out STEM workers by nativity. And I think I can imagine several papers, let alone projects, that would look at that. And this will counter, I think, some of the perspectival critique of the book. Because if you take the perspective that regional or national prosperity hinges on human capital, in particular lines of work like STEM, particularly IT or computers, then I think the anxiety over who's coming and who's taking these jobs will be at least dial back a bit. The second piece of research, and this gets into a line the authors have about Indian skilled immigrants having restricted choices on where they live. I was quite taken with that. So here we have, highly educated, well-remunerated individuals who are constrained in their residential choice. That doesn't work for me. I mean, the whole thing about residential choice is that if you have income and if you have education, you have actually quite a large residential choice. What the authors were referring to, of course, is that a lot of these jobs are deeply concentrated in a few places. San Francisco and the Bay Area is one obvious location, but you can look at other locations within the United States, say Seattle or Austin, Texas, or a few, maybe in North Carolina. And of course, the housing and labor market in San Francisco is very unusual. But there's a research agenda here, and it's to do with residential choice within a metro area, thinking about home-work relations. This is something that certainly a cadre of geographers have been very interested in understanding. Types of work, location of work, and location of home, those three things go together. How do they work for this group? And what is that articulation? And I think there's some potentially interesting research there. The other research agenda, and it started by an undergraduate of mine who's now in a master's program at another Ivy League institution, not this one. She got really interested in the residential choice of Asians and Asian Americans in the Bay Area and their effect on schooling and the school district and white flight from those locations. So I think, and again, this is maybe a sort of perspectival comment, but looking at it from a sort of an American perspective, the presence of particular groups in particular neighborhoods has particular effects. And I think there is a deep sociological study that could be made of that, thinking about interethnic relations based on residential neighborhood, qualifications of parents, skills of parents, and pressure that they put on their children. I have to end with a small irritant. I don't like the word illegal immigrant. I will take any public forum and every microphone I have to say no book should include the word illegal immigrant. Illegal is a a dialectical relation. An individual is not illegal. It's a relational kind of statement or label. I'd much prefer the authors use the term unauthorized or undocumented. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Our final commentator is our own John Logan, who is a professor of sociology and until recently was director of S4, the university's initiative on spatial structures in the social sciences. For a lot of his scholarly life, he's worked on migration, immigration, and patterns, spatial patterns, emergent ghettos, black neighborhoods in New York and Chicago, Chinese in the United States, growth, dispersal, and integration, segregation and neighborhood change in northern cities, new historical GIS data, etc., etc. So a very large part of John's career has been devoted to issues of immigration. Let's see what he has to say on Indian immigration to the United States.
Oh, thank you. Well, I wondered what we were going to do with all this time, but apparently there's a lot to say. And it's been very interesting. Now, how do I get my PowerPoint to show up here? I'm sure there's a, it's obvious. It's right there. Oh, thank you. So I'm indebted to our
So now you have to be
author.
nice to me.
Yes, yes, yes. So the first thing I want to say is from a sociological point of view, the big question here is what's the relation of immigration and of immigrants in the United States to the society as a whole? And one way to put that is just how do we treat our immigrants here? Or what are their prospects? That's the big question. And for some long time, whenever anybody talked about immigrants in America, so well, wait, there's no such thing as immigrants because there's just all kinds of immigrants. And a virtue of this book is that by focusing on Indians, well, it's a particular kind of immigrant. And you'll notice from my title, I'm interested in a number of groups that are high performing in the ways that Indians are also high performing as an immigrant group. Another category that I object to, not as strongly, I think, as Richard objects to illegal immigrants, is Asians, Asian immigrants. There's no such thing as Asians in the world. There's Indians, and there's Chinese and Filipinos, and there's, okay. So the question of understanding what is the category that we need to study is really important, and understanding the diversity of kinds of immigration. There's the Asian immigration and the Latino one, but among Asians there's the this one and the that one. And another virtue of the book is for people who, like me, are really rather ignorant about India, is the point that to talk about Indian immigrants actually is not quite right, because there's so many kinds of Indians. And just in the presentation that Devesh made this evening, you notice that he listed all those different kinds. I've heard of Gujarati, by the way. I know that one. And not very many of the others, to be honest. But they're different. They're different from different parts of the country. It's a different migration stream. They come to some degree with different backgrounds and different statuses. And in America, they probably don't even live together in the same place. So the notion that we're going to study Indian immigration and the role of Indian immigrants in America is a little bit problematic. But again, a virtue of the book is that the authors clarify some of these differences, and they're very, very helpful. It's interesting, given that I'm saying that actually that I want to go in the other direction a little bit and say, okay, I mean, I could go more in terms of what are these specific little groups and how are they different from each other. But actually, I want to go in the direction of asking how a particular category of groups, and I just today made up this phrase, high-performing immigrant groups. I've never used that before. I may decide after the discussion today that I shouldn't use it in the future either. But I want to point out that there's a number of groups, not just Indians, who share some characteristics that may be consequential and that may shed some light on the sociological question of the relation of immigrants to America. So what are these groups? And look across the board, and there's a number of groups that something they have in common with each other is a very high rate of acceleration of growth from the 1990s to the present. And Indians are one. Indians are, let's see, does this show? I don't really have a point. Oh, is this a pointer? No, that's not. That's not what I wanted to do. Let's see. I'm going to just forget about high tech and just kind of point over there and say, you see the Indians? So there weren't very many, and then there were a lot more, and then there were a lot more. And just the growth over time is very amazing. But the same thing could be said about Chinese. In fact,
Press
maybe
this, then
Oh,
it'll, this one, yeah.
this one.
Yeah, that'll allow you to focus.
So now I'm high tech.
Are you high-tech?
That's the Indian influence. I know it is. I know. I'm just an American social scientist. You got, okay. Anyway, so the Chinese even more, and the Filipinos even more, and the Indians too. And this is the way that I think about this book. In fact, it's a book that is motivated by a desire to provide a portrait of Indians in America, and so reasonably it focuses on Indians, and Indians are special, and I want to mention that from my perspective, it's Indians also. Indians are another of several groups, and you may be most surprised at the last one that I added at the end. I'm talking about African immigrants. They're not Asians. No, what do they have to do? They're black, by the way. So what do they have to do other than just that the numbers have grown a lot? There's not that many yet, but it's on the way up. Anyway, so I want to ask, I'm going to make the point with a very few slides that these are all not only rapidly growing groups, but that they have in common that they're doing remarkably well in the United States as immigrant groups, with a lot of similarities across them. And I want to raise questions about what does that mean about these groups as immigrant groups' relation to America? Are they successful? Are they incorporated? Are they assimilated? The term assimilation is used by sociologists to refer to something more than that they're managing. They came to America, and as an immigrant group, as a minority, it's more than that they're managing. It's that they become American. That's the idea of assimilation, that they identify as Americans, that they lose a little bit of their ethnic distinction, that some of the hurdles that they face, that perhaps they individually faced when they first arrived, or that their group faced when they first arrived in large numbers, that those fade over time. And so the social boundaries between groups have a tendency, according to assimilation theory, to fade out. Maybe not to entirely disappear, but to fade out. Do they assimilate as a result of their high performance? That's what I'd like to talk about. That's the sociological question. That's the research agenda that I would like to see pursued. So, what do we know about them? First of all, they all have a high level of education. I'm using a different indicator than others have shown you tonight. I'm talking about the median years of education, not the percent with a graduate degree, or not whether they're in a STEM field or not, but just median years of education. And except for the Vietnamese, who are way down here, all of the others are at the level of non-Hispanic whites or higher. They are high human capital. I didn't include Mexicans or African Americans on this chart. If I had, you would have thought that the Vietnamese actually aren't doing so bad. But by high performing, I mean in comparison to non-Hispanic whites, who we might use as a reference point for what is being successful in the United States. So median years of education is high for every one of them, and Indian is the highest, so they stand out here. Households below the poverty line is another indicator of how a group is doing. And this is something that in the book the point is made that that there's variation. There's inequality within the group. Not everybody is successful. There's the unsuccessful ones. In my own experience, looking at various Asian origin groups, I've focused on the Chinese as a group that on the one hand has relatively high incomes and high levels of education, but also has a fairly high share of people below the poverty line. And I think of it as a highly polar, it is in terms of income, for sure, I've tested this out with the available data. It is the most polarized social group, with a large share of people really at the very low end of income, but also a very large share at the upper end. Highly polarized, but except for Filipinos and maybe Japanese, and actually Indians are a little bit below the non-white high poverty rate, but all of these groups, despite having a large share of people who are doing quite well, there's this other side that has to be understood, and they have that pretty much in common. Let's see, before I go there, I want to talk about the question of, and how did they get where they got in terms of high incomes and high education and so on, high performance in terms of social class? Is it by assimilation or the erasure of the boundaries between the groups? Do they now, because you're making $100,000, now you're equal, are you equal under the law? Are you no longer as Indian as you were before because now you're rich? That's the kind of question that I want to ask. And there's a couple of things that militate against that kind of interpretation. And these are mentioned in the book, and this is another strength of the book, is that they look into these questions. First of all of them are highly dependent on their immigration status. Immigration status is not a variable in the census, and I've never been able to use it. But along with the H-1B visa or the J visa or the whatever visa that you've got, is a whole range of restrictions on what you can do and when you can do it, and under what conditions you can do it. So that's a constraint on what I would call a full incorporation into American society in class terms. Their occupational position is constrained not by that they can't do a job that requires a lot of skill and even a job that pays you pretty well, but you're not free to move. In fact, I've had former graduate students who I sponsored for an H-1B visa, and they were pretty much indentured to me. As a result, they couldn't freely move. They had, they had H-1B as long as they were working for me, right? It's not free. And I think a line of research that would be very interesting to carry out beyond what's already been done in this book is to ask, what are the other kinds of constraints and how do they play out in people's lives? How do they perceive them? Do people feel that they are persecuted by them? Do they feel that it's just a burden? Is the fact that you have to hire a lawyer and pay thousands of dollars just to get the next paperwork in, does that make you feel different? Does that make you feel marginalized? That's the kind of question I'd like to ask in terms of that. Another factor here is that whether they're in the high performing end or the high poverty end of the occupational distribution for every one of these groups, the way that they participate in the labor market is very intimately tied up with their ethnic origins, with their national origin and with the ethnic community that they are part of in the United States. Every single one. The Chinese and the Koreans often are entrepreneurs. They've been highly concentrated in the restaurant business and the garment industry. And a lot of other Chinese work for these entrepreneurs, so their jobs are tied to the ethnic labor market. We heard a little bit about the motel industry, the taxi industry, and then the outsourcing firms from India through which people in India get jobs in the United States. It's another ethnic connection. So a point I would make is that while they are successful, they are not successful in a way that demonstrates that they have transcended the ethnic identities and the social boundaries between groups that they come into the country with, but rather it's a maintenance and a reproduction of those boundaries. So this is not assimilation. This is a way that America figures out how to incorporate people and take advantage of them in the labor force, and for some of them even to pay them well, while still maintaining the strong boundaries in terms of social presence and legal presence. So that's on the one side of it. Now I'd like to talk about where people live. And what is this? This is the neighborhood racial composition of places where people live. For Africans, I had to use the 2000 census because the most recent data, Africans are not a race category, and so I can't depend on the 100% decennial census to give me data about them. Chinese are a race category, and Indians are a race category, and this was an interesting question you bring up in your book, is why did they demand to be a race category, and why were they so happy when they triumphantly succeeded in being a race category, but Africans are not? And so it's hard even to know how many Africans there are anywhere. But for 2000, I sort of believe that I've got it. So what is the story here? First of all, every one of these groups, the Chinese, the Filipinos, the Indians, the Koreans, live in neighborhoods that 20% approximately of their neighbors are Asian, now using that large Asian category. And that's compared to they live in areas that maybe only 10% are Asian overall, like in the county, at the county level. So they're disproportionately Asian, and you could say they are segregated and they are clustered. They certainly are clustered. But on the other hand, what they also have in common is that all of them live in neighborhoods on average, well, almost all are majority white neighborhoods. So these are racial minorities living in a segregated environment that is clustered with other people of their same background, more or less, but nevertheless living in predominantly white, majority white settings, which is not true for African Americans and is not true for Latinos in the United States. This is one of the privileges of being the high-performing group. But it's not just the high-performing group, because when we do analyses where we take into account what is the effect of your income level on what kind of neighborhood you live in, it turns out that even African Americans and Latinos who make more than $75,000 live in poorer neighborhoods and more minority neighborhoods than whites or Asians, again, using that category, who make less than $40,000. So it's not just that Indians and Koreans and Filipinos can buy into racially distinctive neighborhoods, but that they are able to buy in if they've got the money, whereas African Americans and Latinos generally don't have that capacity. So that makes them different, and you might say, so that makes them equal. I wrote a paper, put a report out on the internet through S4 under the title "Separate but Equal." This is kind of provocative. That's why I did it. I thought it was a provocative title, "Separate but Equal." Yeah, these Asian groups are separate but equal in terms of where they live. But and are they equal, and why are they equal, and what does it mean that they are equal? I'd like to just give another indicator of the nature of their neighborhoods. This is where the average group member lives. What are their neighbors like at the census tract level? And the average white lives in a neighborhood that is 70% homeowners, and that's distinctive. Non-Hispanic whites in America have had advantaged access to homeownership forever. And some other groups are just kind of catching up over time. It takes time to accumulate the wealth and the potential to have home equity to be homeowners, but it's been happening over time. But all of these groups, all of them are over 50%, and many close to 60%, and they were all rising except for the housing bust after 2008. Everything dropped a little bit, but it's been lately moving back up. So they're high performing in terms of living in neighborhoods that are predominantly homeowners, and they're also high performing in terms of living in neighborhoods where their neighbors have college degrees. They live in high educated neighborhoods, more so, mostly more so, than non-Hispanic whites. So they're just doing great in the neighborhood, separate but equal. And now I want to raise the question of, does this mean that the separate part of it actually doesn't matter anymore because they end up living in good neighborhoods? My major concern about the situation for African Americans and Latinos in terms of their residential placement is not so much that they're segregated, but they live in the worst places, and they send their kids to the school districts that have the worst schools, and they have the highest crime rates, and they're the ones where the lead is in the water, and the infant mortality is high. And so that's what I'm concerned about in terms of neighborhoods. And by golly, the Chinese and the Filipinos and the Indians and the Koreans and even the Africans don't have that problem. And it's partly because of their income and education. Does this mean that the social boundaries between them and non-Hispanic whites, between these largely immigrant groups and the American mainstream, have disappeared? Well, you might think so. They certainly have overcome disadvantages. On the other hand, what we know about how they get to where they get suggests something different. And here I want to make use of a distinction between immigrant enclaves and ethnic communities. And this is something that I was so pleased that Devesh decided to quote. You didn't quote much of my work in your book, but this one you did, and right on. It's relevant here because the argument is that while the old literature suggested that immigrants live in bad neighborhoods, they live in poor neighborhoods, low rent neighborhoods, bad housing neighborhoods, high crime neighborhoods, you name it, when they first arrive because they don't have the resources to do better, but that there's an assimilation process that over time they get to move out of these places into better places. And when they succeed in America, they buy into places where they're living with non-Hispanic whites, not with people like them. their origins. They get out of segregated settings. The opposite hypothesis is the ethnic community hypothesis, which is that actually what some immigrant groups prefer is to live with people of their same background, and that they'll pay more to do it. And in fact, so I've done some research on this question, and it turns out that for several of the groups listed here, unlike what you would find for Mexicans, for example, or even African Americans, when they have more resources, they pay higher rent to live in a more racially mixed neighborhood. For Indians and Filipinos especially, it is true that when they have higher education, when they become homeowners, when they have higher income and higher and more professional occupational status, those are the ones who live in the concentrations of Indians and Filipinos around. They choose more segregated environments. Now, what are the segregated environments that they're choosing? First of all, they're high-quality environments. They have good schools. Housing prices are high. That's why it's expensive to get there, and only they can live in these places. And they're not majority Indian and majority Filipino neighborhoods. They're majority white neighborhoods with, however, disproportionately high clusters of co-ethnics. And so the ethnic community hypothesis is that there are some groups that maintain social boundaries because they like them, they prefer them, and they'll pay for them. Right? So again, both in terms of the labor market and class position and in terms of residential patterns, my point of view, and I think it's illustrated with the data on Indians, but also the data on other high-performing immigrant groups, is that what we see their high performance and their living in better neighborhoods as demonstrating because of the processes that put them there. What is being demonstrated is the maintenance of social boundaries, not their dissolution. Thank you.
So we have 9 minutes left, and it would be awkward not to have some questions from the audience. So let's say we give you 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes towards the end, and let's see if there are some questions from the audience. Yes, two hands I can see. Let's go to you first here.
Hi, my name's Anar. I'm a third-year PhD student in anthropology, and my dissertation is on South Asian American political engagement. And I'll be doing my dissertation fieldwork in Chicago starting in September. And I just wanted to talk about you talked about political incorporation, and I just wanted to talk about, so in last March, a 15-year-old reporter was doing a piece for NPR Youth Radio on Hispanic youth as a voting bloc. And when she was asked by the reporter why she decided to study Hispanic, she said, well, I'm Indian American and we're not a sought after voting constituency. So I wanted to do research on a group of people that's more sought after. So I wanted to sort of point to your point about assimilation, and that naturalization is equivalent to assimilation, and then sort of your data on political behavior. And I'm just curious what you sort of have to say about Indian Americans as maybe having the highest numbers of voting as Democrats, but that they still remain invisible as constituencies, as a constituency, and connecting that then to Indian American as an analytic category, as opposed to South Asian American, which would include Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and then depending on how far you extend it, to Sri Lankans, Nepalis, and those from Bhutan, though that's a smaller number. And that is, I don't know if you read Sanjay Mishra's Desis Divided on ethno-racial mobilization, which is to say that unlike other groups, South Asian Americans have not achieved political incorporation in the U.S. because of their sort of continued separation along lines of religion, language, caste, and class, education, income, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of my very extended, multi-part question on your thoughts on that.
On the first part,
Well, sort of,
no. I'll just tell you. This is you matter electorally in a college, electoral college, if you're in a swing state. If Indians are in California and they are Democrats, and they're in New York and they're Democrats, they really don't matter in terms of franchise. They might matter politically in some other way, and Devesh will say something. That's straightforward political science point, but he'll have something else to say on that. Yes. Yeah.
I'm going to qualify my identity in this conversation before I ask my question. I'm from South Africa.
Yeah.
I'm not from India. I'm not from America. I'm a fourth generation South African, and caste died a long time where I come from. And my question is around caste.
Yeah.
It seems as though the way the system is set up in the Indian context, caste is clearly a determinant. It's a driver amongst others. And I would assume that caste also travels into the American context.
I see.
Alongside race, ethnicity, class, and so on. And I'm very intrigued if the book kind of looks at how the material existence of caste impacts on marriage relationships, transactional network relationships, and so on and so forth.
So the role of caste in the Indian American community. Prerna.
Thank you so much. I greatly enjoyed both your discussion as well as the comments from the panel. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the effect of this immigration back on India beyond the kind of obvious effects of a reverse brain drain of the kind of most highly qualified people, and in particular the kind of ethnic composition of the immigrants, and to what extent kind of beyond what we know, which is funding of maybe more Hindu nationalist groups, interesting Democrat voting in the US, but usually in a pattern of kind of the diaspora funding extra nationalist religious associations back home seems to fit that pattern. So how do you kind of put the social conservatism, Democrat voting, but the kind of political effects back home, but also broadly, beyond the fact that these are obviously a kind of great loss of human capital to India and the kind of political, what they support politically. I mean, you've thought so much about this. What are the kind of broader implications for both society and politics and economy?
I've heard Devesh respond to that question. I think he's absolutely ready to answer that one. So, one last question.
Hi, Devesh. My name is Nipa. And my work is actually looking at entrepreneurs of Indian origin that are returning to India. So it's great to meet you, and give us your best and brightest was so kind of important and instrumental in my work. And so I really appreciate kind of being able to move forward from what you're doing. I did have a question. My own research, I have a chapter that I call IBMC IITP as the typical profile, since everyone likes acronyms in India. So it's Indian, Brahmin, middle class, IIT educated, Ivy League technology professional. It's a long mouthful. I wanted to not talk about the 1980s, and I'm sorry, the 90s and 2000s move of a lot of these entrepreneurs that are moving back to India, but rather look probably more in this kind of Chicago or second tier city. I'm thinking about my own empirical coming from Wisconsin and looking at that same kind of 1960s to 80s migration of people who are settling here that are middle class and upper middle class. I'm sure you've been getting this question, but I wanted to think about the Trump election and that slide you had about kind of participation of Indian Americans and the kind of immense religious participation or participation in organizations. What I've empirically seen is with the rise of Indian and Hindu temples coming up, there's also increased BJP support and more of a platform for this kind of Hindutva, Hindu nationalist right-wing support that's kind of being institutionalized in a bit by the kind of community development of religion. I don't know if you've seen that, but it seems like this last election there was an impact on Trump voters that wanted to support an anti-Muslim platform. And so I was curious about, the new election and how that kind of feeds into your own research, and if you've seen a correlation between community development and this increasing right wing.
So I promised you 5 minutes, so we'll go over by 3 minutes, huh? And then we'll get together for reception after this. So yes, Devish.
Thank you all, and I especially want to thank the panelists for their very stimulating comments. So just to give you a background of how we came to write this book. when I wrote my last book, which was on the impact of migration from India on India, I had gone to give a talk in Silicon Valley, and where actually you have the first sort of India center as opposed to a narrow sectarian center, which the Silicon Valley people of high net worth had helped build. It's a broad community center. And actually, one of the key funders is an Indian Muslim couple. And they asked me a question. They said, does your book help to answer why so many of us came as professionals but became entrepreneurs? That in India at the time, entrepreneurship was something that was frowned. If you were middle class, you were a professional. Entrepreneurship was confined to certain groups and was generally looked at with some disdain. You know, you were probably making money the wrong way if you were in entrepreneurship. And it was this question that actually began the study. So to tell you, yes, actually the government of India gave us 2 million and we returned 1.5 million. It was for 3 studies, a paper on remittances. It was on entrepreneurs and their engagement with India. So they were not interested in Indians in America in any other sense, other than they were interested in how it would help India's economy. It was a very narrow thing. But the government of India, being the government of India, we thought it was a big pain, and we said, please keep your money. But we had done a lot of work, and we realized we had a range of data that could ask a much bigger and other interesting questions. So that was a seed, but that was it. Okay, so now, one of the things you rightly said, Prema, we are not sociologists. And frankly, we make it abundantly clear we have no pretensions. And, you know, every field will approach a subject from their disciplinary lens, and we approach it from our disciplinary lens. That has its strengths, it has its weaknesses. And our intention was actually to give a broad overview. It was not to have one argument. If there is an argument, it is, this is not a simple story. There is a range of, there's a much greater diversity. And frankly, we wanted to puncture a range of shibboleths. One of the shibboleths is something called South Asia. Academics believe much more in South Asia than people from South Asia believe in the concept, by a margin of 50-1. It is not even a close call, okay? Every survey you ask self-identification, if you ask, and these are nationwide surveys, if you ask, do you classify yourself as Asian American, Asian American, South Asian American, Indian American? The South Asian American is barely 2%. And I would suspect those 2% are largely within academia. Okay, and so we want to really puncture that we made it very clear in the book. There are lots of interesting questions you can ask. We try to only answer those for which we had solid data. That means that there's lots of things you can't ask, actually, which might be actually much more interesting questions. But we are very clear on the limitations of our methodological approach of what you can't. Census data does not ask on religion and caste. That's the US Census. Pew has some, it doesn't have caste, it has religion, but the Pew sample sizes are way too small to do anything that's robust statistical analysis. So I want to be very clear that the method we chose also had its limitations on the questions we could ask. But we do not in the least bit shy away from the limitations of the book because of the methods we chose, because we were very, very clear that there are all these things. For instance, Prerna's thing that Indians in the US support Hindutva groups. It's one of the biggest shibboleths that's out there, and it's frankly quite nonsensical. Of course they support Hindutva groups, but you have to ask yourself, is it 1% of what the BJP's Hindutva groups in India? Any Indian political party which has any self-respect can make 100 times that money in a week what Indian Americans can send. India has way lot of money. Indian politicians are far more creative in raising money than, frankly, the bunch of Indian Americans put together. They don't need Indian Americans. It is an icing on the cake, it's not the cake. You know, a good Indian politician as a chief minister can raise 1,000 crores in a year. Amount of money that comes here might be $5–10 million. This is a chief minister. I'm not even talking of the central government. So you have to put, yes, money goes, but that money is a tiny fraction of the sources of funding of Hindutva groups within India, and that is coming largely from within India. But this is something that comes across, we find, repeatedly. And one of the things that comes across is that, you know, it's the usual thing, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So the guys who scream and shout most about pro-Modi or pro-Hindutva, everyone says, see, we told you so, these guys are all like that. But of course, the two things one has to understand, most immigrants who come here do not care about politics. Academics care about politics. We think it's about it morning, evening, and night. Most immigrants who come don't give a damn about politics, at least in the initial years, because they are really trying to improve their economic lives. As I showed you, most immigrants from India have come here after 2000. They are not naturalized. Therefore, of course, they will not have political engagement in the US. They care about political things happening because if it affects visa policies, etc. But by and large, they are trying to make their economic lives and their children's lives. Each time I go, the reception of the book in Indian American communities is very different from academics. And I find the dissonance is so different because, of course, the sorts of things we are obsessed with, race or religion, or we think they must be too. But actually, you know, they're not that obsessed with these things. I'm sorry. Most of them actually are obsessed with making some more money, you know, getting their kids to the right place, worried about visa status, the sorts of things about most ordinary people's lives. And so I just want to sort of say that is a very important reason why we did not look at race. Because the debates about immigration in the US get almost overtaken by that one factor. And our thing was very simple. Look, if in a single generation you come from a country and emerge as the highest income group, you know, racial discrimination could not have been that terrible. You cannot emerge at the top by being so much under the weight of racial discrimination. You can't have it.
That terrible for your community.
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis your community.
Exactly.
It could be.
It could be very important. So we did not want to, we made all of these assumptions with all of its caveats and of course problems right up front. That's not the lens we look at. We don't have religion. That is a big thing because, as I said, the data does not have good data. I mean, if we are doing India-wide and systematic in a way, we can confidently say every piece of data we have is statistically robust. And we don't look at questions where that data is not robust, with all its obvious, lacuna that comes with the sorts of questions that you can't ask because of that. And that is an undoubted weakness. But that is precisely why I hope, Prerna, your work and of your colleagues will help fill those gaps. Shall I take 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Huh? Okay.
2 more minutes.
Now, see, I think we are also locked into views of India. India is changing rapidly, and with that, those who come from India, like to the US. Those who are getting access to higher education now is very different. IIT engineers are 0.5 to 0.7% of all engineers being produced in India. Actually, IIT engineers are not coming to the US. The engineers coming to the US now are from other engineering colleges, most of whom you have never even heard the names of. I did a sample thing of all master students in engineering from India. By the way, US universities use master's programs in engineering. It's the biggest cash cow. And it's only Chinese and Indian students, right, who come from terrible programs, but this is a way to get a signaling value of education. And I just sat with the those who were admitted, not the applicants. several hundred over the last 3 years. I would say 95% of the colleges, and I know India reasonably well, I have no idea about the names of these colleges. Absolutely, these are all colleges you have not heard of. I think the thing is that if immigrants get locked into a view of their country in the past, I think academics also get locked into their views both about India and the US. And things are more dynamic, I think, than I think we think that is happening, which is sort of what we tried to capture in this book. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for.